Hey, I'm Josh, and this is the Camera Project. Today we're doing something a little bit different and having a discussion about the recently announced Panasonic S1 and S1R. Today joining me is special guest you may recognize, Jay O'Mara.
Hey, Josh, how are you? Good to see you.
Good. For those of you who don't remember, Jay is one of the original founders of the Camera Project with me, so I thought no better person to discuss this really exciting announcement from Panasonic. Let's start going.
Yes,
I want to start out by saying that, neither of us have seen this camera. This is, we're looking at the specs and all the information we've been given, just like you guys. So we're not talking firsthand experience. We've been told nothing under NDA or anything like that. We're just going on pure announcement and talking about what we think of the camera and, our overall feelings.
Right. So, why us, right? Why would we give you any of this information if you've already seen it? I think it's because we have a unique perspective being hobbyist photographers with, a little bit of paid work on the side. But both of us work full-time in video post-production. So we see a lot of video footage, including stuff from Red and ARRI and the Canon Cinema, a lot of Sony stuff, both the A line and the FS series, including a decent amount of Panasonic Vlog. So anytime that Panasonic releases something that it touches the video world, it's of particular interest to us.
Right, and of course, being camera reviewers, we've both touched a lot of cameras, so we kind of have a unique perspective on not just one system, let's say Sony or Nikon or Canon, but we've used the Olympus, the Panasonic, the Sony, the Fuji, all the major mirrorless brands. So we have a good perspective on what each brand has brought to the table thus far.
So Josh, where do you think Panasonic is kind of in this marketplace right now?
Yeah, so I think it's an interesting question, and I think that starting with the GH2 and especially the GH3 and GH4, Panasonic really became known for their hybrid cameras, but really more for their video prowess than for their photography. And with the GH5 and especially the G9, they've really started to take the photography end seemingly a lot more seriously. But I think one of the major issues has always been, while people loved the Micro Four Thirds system for its video and all of the features that Panasonic added, they felt that for certain types of work, for instance, low light and dynamic range and things like that, the smaller sensor was always a hindrance, which is my guess as to why they decided to introduce a second line of cameras.
So Panasonic is coming into this with 10 years of mirrorless systems under their belt, plus a really long and impressive track history of video, especially shot in camera. So while we don't know a ton about the specifics of this camera beyond what they've released, we have a couple of pretty good assumptions based on Panasonic's past and also what else is currently on the market, both from Sony, Nikon, and Canon, who have just announced some new cameras recently.
Right, so let's talk about what we do know about this camera thus far. Jay, what are your opinions on what you've seen of the size of the cameras?
Okay, so what we do know about the camera, based on the pictures and some of the video we've seen, is that it's physically larger than the GH5, which makes sense because it is a substantially larger sensor that is being housed in the body. And in addition to that, they're releasing two versions of this camera. They are releasing the S1 at 24 megapixels, and they are releasing the S1R at 47 megapixels.
Yeah, and it seems like the two cameras are more or less identical other than this megapixel count and therefore the sensor that's in them. But everything else, including the features, seems, more or less from what we know so far to be identical. So let's talk about some of those features. And I think most importantly is what is the lens mount and what we know of that.
Panasonic is adopting the L mount standard, which was created by Leica, but is now being embraced by Leica, Sigma, and Panasonic. And what this should allow is, similar to the Micro Four Thirds system, should allow companies, both lenses and body companies, like Panasonic making bodies, Panasonic also making lenses, Sigma making lenses, to mix and match a little bit. So for instance,
also making bodies, actually. They announced their
Sigma's making bodies now?
Yeah, they announced they're converting their cameras to this mount, so it's going to have the Foveon sensor. Basically their cameras will be coming out with this mount as well. I don't know anyone who has ever owned a Sigma camera. I did see one once in person, but anyway, continue.
Well, so the point though is that because it is a quote-unquote open standard, what it promises is that you should be able to buy a camera body from several different manufacturers and pair it with a lens from several different manufacturers. So for instance, you could buy the S1 from Panasonic and pair it with a $5,000 Leica lens, which would give you, in theory, an extremely high-end professional photography setup. Or, assuming Sigma comes out with some very reasonably priced, say, medium zoom lenses, standard zoom lenses, you could buy the S1 body and pair it with a moderately priced Sigma lens and have a much more cost-effective but still incredibly powerful and assumingly great-looking product camera that you can own.
Right, and I think one of the things that no one's really talking about this is my hope would be that there's full interoperability between them, in that a lot of people talk about Micro Four Thirds like you could kind of switch between Olympus and Panasonic without any consequence, and that's true for the most part, except if you want things like dual image stabilization. Panasonic cameras only work with Panasonic lenses, and Olympus cameras only work with Olympus lenses. So I hope that there's full-on parity between these lenses, so if you have a stabilized Sigma lens, it will work with dual IS with a Panasonic body, and vice versa with the Leicas and the Sigmas. I hope that there's no sort of gotchas to it like there is with Micro Four Thirds currently.
What we do know is that Panasonic has announced that they are committed to coming out with 10 lenses for this system by 2020. And we hope that Leica's already well on their way, but that Sigma will also release a decent amount of options for this mount as well.
Yeah, I think I saw a number that they will be, in addition to creating new lenses, I think the number was 14 of their current lenses will be converted to this mount. And I think there are specifics on which one of their lenses those are. So that is a recent update as well. So yeah, Panasonic has said that by the end of 2020, there will be more than 10 Panasonic lenses for this system. There's seemingly at launch or near launch, there will be a 51.4 aperture lens. And then there's going to be a 24-105, we don't know the aperture, and a 70-200, we don't know the aperture. My guess and hope for the 24-105 would be an f4. I think that would be a great sort of do-everything kind of lens that could hit a reasonable price and size and weight. The 70-200, I don't know if it'll be a 2.8 or an f4, but hopefully one of those two. Now, moving on from the lenses, what else do we know, Jay, about this camera body?
So, in addition to the exciting lens mount, they also announced that they have 2 card slots in this camera, which is a big deal. We know that's a big deal.
Yeah. I don't know if you've seen the forums on the Canon and Nikon announcements, but 2 slots or death. Okay.
Yeah, 2 slots or death. That's it. People are very upset about this.
I had that tattooed somewhere very secretive recently. Anyway, continue.
It's going on my head. So we know that the 2 card slots are different. One of the card slots is XQD, and the other card slot is SD. Now, there's a lot of reasons why that is a positive thing. One of the reasons is that SD cards tend to be substantially cheaper. The other reason is that XQD cards tend to be faster. So we don't exactly know yet how this is going to work. We don't know if there's going to be full redundant recording from the XQD slot onto the SD slot, for instance. But it is a really nice option, even if it's just a matter of choosing what type of card you're going to use. It's nice to be able to have that option.
Yeah, and my guess, just based on the G9 and GH5, would be that the XQD is going to be your main card slot, and there will be some sort of significant buffer in the camera to be copying everything, including video, if we're using those cameras as an example, for full redundancy to the SD card, or at least that's the hope. So we don't know, but we can move on because we don't know.
The other exciting thing about this camera is that it shoots 4K at 60 FPS, presumably in camera. So this would be the first full-frame camera that shoots 4K at 60 FPS, which could be one of the reasons why they put the XQD slot in this camera, to take advantage of perhaps higher bit rates or perhaps higher color depth. We don't know for sure. They have not announced all of those specs yet, but our hopes are high.
Yes, definitely. Our hopes are very high. And one of the places where I would say my hopes have been slightly disappointed is in the announcement of what the screen is. Now, it sounds like the EVF is going to be fantastic, super high resolution, but the LCD on the back, unfortunately, seems like they're using sort of the 3-axis screen, sort of like the XT2 and now XT3 have, and also some of the Pentax K cameras in the past have had. But that is not a fully articulating screen. It tilts up and down, and then it kind of hinges to one side, but it's not nearly as versatile as having a fully articulating screen. For instance, I'm recording myself right now with a fully articulating screen, and I can roughly glance over every so often to make sure I'm still in focus or still in frame, and I cannot do that with this camera, and I think it's a huge mistake on their part. Jay?
So whether or not that's a deal breaker really comes down to who's buying this camera and why you're buying it. So there are certainly people who use their mirrorless cameras to shoot a lot of, say, video blogs. In a situation like that, having a fully articulating screen is incredibly helpful. However, it seems like Panasonic is positioning this perhaps to really appeal more to still photographers. I'm not really sure yet. We don't really know why they've chosen to go this route with the LCD screen. So there's a couple of trade-offs with this camera, as there are with every camera, and it's really going to be up to what you value as a consumer to really depend on if those trade-offs are deal breakers or not.
Yeah, I would say that alone, you know, it may not be 100% of a deal breaker for me, but it's certainly a major deterrent, as it will be for a lot of people. And my thought is almost, you know, all right, if the 24 megapixel S1 is your video, more hybrid version, whereas the 47 megapixel is more of the still-based one, well, then they should have done the 3-axis screen on the 47 and the fully articulating on the 24. But, you know, obviously there's cost associated with, you know, having two different bodies. So, you know, I sort of get it, but I don't.
So another one of these hot button issues is the autofocus system in this camera. They have announced that they're sticking with the DFD contrast-based autofocus system. And depending on how you feel about autofocus and how you feel about previous cameras, that may or may not be a deal breaker for you.
Yeah, it's funny because if you look at the internet forums and people talking about Panasonic's autofocus, you know, you would think that it's a really bad autofocus system, and I really strongly disagree for photography. I found that the G9 and GH5 stills autofocus was really quite excellent. I don't think it was up to the level of the contrast and phase-based auto detect in the Sony, you know, A7R III or the A7 III, but I do think that it was very good. Now, video is where they've seen the biggest amount of complaining, and I agree that it has been poor. They do keep updating it with firmware, and you know, we'll see how good they can make it on those cameras. But that said, we don't know, is this a totally new generation of DFD autofocus? I know I was lucky enough to be invited to a press event for the GH5 launch before it came out, and they talked about how the analysis is working. And I don't remember the exact number, whether it was 420 or 480, but basically, let's say it's 420 times per second. The camera is actually evaluating the autofocus that many times in every second. So let's say they're able to double that number with a faster processor. This autofocus could be amazing. So I don't think that we can judge it just based on the fact that it's contrast detect. I do agree there are some inherent problems for video with contrast-based auto detection in that it has to kind of go past and go back to find its point. But if that's so fast that the human eye can't detect it, then it might be totally fine. And I think, you know, the jury is still out on whether or not this is good or bad.
The one thing that we can definitely agree on is that dual image stabilization, both in camera and in lens, is an excellent feature. That helps with low light photography, it helps with handheld video shooting, and if especially the other manufacturers can make their lenses work with the dual image stabilization, we could end up with a really phenomenal line of great lenses that are stabilized and a camera body that's also stabilized in case you want to use some legacy glass.
Yeah, I remember going back to the first review that we ever shot for the camera project. We reviewed the Sony A7 II, and it was the first camera that either of us had used with sensor-based stabilization. And I remember Jay having a quote something along the lines of, once you use this feature, it's really hard to go back. And that dual image stabilization takes it even further. And this will be the first full-frame mirrorless camera to actually achieve dual image stabilization, which we've previously seen on the Micro Four Thirds cameras from Panasonic and from Olympus, and has been fantastic. Now, it is a larger sensor, so we don't know if they'll be able to do it as well as they do in Micro Four Thirds. But even if it comes close, I think that people will really love these cameras for that feature alone.
So let's run through a couple other things quickly that they've announced. This camera is going to have full weather sealing, which I think is necessary for a professional style camera. It also is announced that they're going to have the highest flash sync speed on the market.
Yeah, we don't know if that's, most cameras are 1/250th of a second. If it's 1/500th even, that's a big deal to people who shoot with flash. So let's hope that it's even higher, but even a small increment like that would be fantastic.
And last but not least, Josh, what is this going to cost me? How many of my children do I need to sell in order to buy this?
So for the low price of we don't know, so we have no idea. But let's talk about where we would like for these cameras to be placed and where we feel they're competitive in the market. And my gut says that their biggest competition here is Sony. So we can look directly at the Sony A7 III and the Sony A7R III. The A7 III coming in at $1999 is where I'd love to see the S1 coming in, and around that $3,500 mark is where I think that they could come with the S1R. That said, in theory, these cameras could best those cameras in certain features, having the dual in-body image stabilization, for instance, having 4K 60 are things that those cameras don't have. So if they're within $200 or $300, I think they're still competitive. That would be my gut. You?
In my mind, I think that the S1 really needs to go for less than $2,500 if it's going to be competitive. $1999 would be a excellent price point to hit. Fingers crossed. We really don't know how this is going to go. This is obviously first generation Panasonic full frame, so we have no idea how their sensor process or costs are going to be. We don't know where these lenses are going to end up, but the hope is, based on what Panasonic has done previously, that this will come in at a competitive price to where Sony sits right now.
So yeah, speaking of Sony, I think we should talk about how this compares to the current Sony lineup, but also to the announcements that we've just seen of the Nikon Z system and the Canon EOS-R. And my initial gut is that it actually sounds pretty comparable to what Sony's offering. The autofocus is my biggest question mark there. And certainly above what Nikon and Canon are, their first announcements have been. Not to say those aren't going to be excellent cameras, I'm sure they are, but purely from a spec perspective, excluding the whole lens factor, which obviously they have an advantage there, just from a body-only perspective, this seems to be besting those cameras, based on specs alone.
On a personal note, I will say that it seems like Nikon, Canon, and especially Sony have better looking bodies than this one. Now, granted, this is based on pictures and is probably going to be very controversial, but that style that they're sticking with for the S1, to me, is neither retro nor particularly modern. So, granted, it doesn't really matter what the camera looks like. It really only matters what kind of pictures and video the camera takes. But if we're just looking at this from a purely, beauty level, then I think that they're at a little bit of a disadvantage here.
Yeah, I know one of the things that you had mentioned there was the screen on top was kind of old school LCD and not the fancy new OLED, black background screens that we've seen on the Fujis and now the Nikons as well.
Yeah, it seems like it's like a side lit LCD, like kind of similar to like an old school Kindle, perhaps. You know, which, granted, it does its job, and if that's you know, if that's all you need it for, really, but you know, it's a whole new, brand new camera. It's a brand new system. It's a brand new lens mount. It was an opportunity to upgrade some of the legacy things that they have been carrying over from generation to generation, and they didn't choose to go that route. So I'll be curious to see if this is a one generation of the new camera, and then the next generation they do more work on the body, or if they're just going to stick with this because they believe that this is the most functional body that they can come out with.
Yeah, I mean, looking at Panasonic's Micro Four Thirds cameras, I would argue that certainly the G9 and GH5 are very utilitarian cameras. Nothing about them speaks to me aesthetically. They get the job done. They're comfortable. They're good to hold. The button placement is good. The screens and the menus are fantastic, but they don't sort of inspire you to grab that camera and go out and shoot. And I know this is very personal. So for me, the way certainly an Olympus OMD EM5 Mark II does, or you know, the Fuji cameras, they've never had that for me. And one of, you know, speaking about this, they look to be very big cameras. And while I agree that for a full frame camera, and certainly for the cooling and things you probably need, a large body is beneficial, I would love to see a more sort of street focused body as well later on in the system. Sort of what Fuji just announced with the GFX 50R, the street version of the system. And, you know, because I want to be able to take my camera with me everywhere, and I don't want to just feel like it's, you know, lugging around this giant thing. And I know that's just me, and if you're using huge lenses anyway.
So, Josh, all
Yes.
that being said, when are you going to come out here and test the camera with me?
The second Panasonic calls me up and sends me a loaner, I will be out there. That is not a promise whatsoever, though.
But, you know, on a side note, this is a really exciting announcement. You know, I have a long history with Panasonic, as I said, starting with the GH2, and I have really liked the way that they have released their cameras over the years. I think that they've done a really nice job of keeping it incremental, but also each generation being substantially better than the last. And if this camera is substantially better than, say, you know, the G9 or the GH5, I have no doubt that it's going to be a fantastic system.
Yeah, so I think if Panasonic is able to deliver on all of the promises we've seen from this announcement of, you know, great quality video, fast autofocus, and, you know, a great set of lenses, I think this has all the potential in the world to be a huge system, and only time will tell. So I want to thank you very much, Jay, for coming to this discussion.
Yeah, Josh, thanks for having me. It was great. And I'm really excited to test this camera out with you once we finally get our hands on it. Panasonic,
Yeah.
call me.
Yeah, that'll be fantastic. Hopefully we can get our hands on this thing shortly after it's coming to market, or even before. So we'll let you know if we do. And let us know in the comments if you like these discussion videos and would like to see more of Jay, or maybe less. And let us know what you think of the S1 or S1R. As always, please subscribe if you like this video.
Thanks, Josh. Good to see you again.
Good to see you too, Jay. Talk soon.